Okay, to wrap things up here in this section, let's go and take a look at the data types that Excel accepts. And let's do that by starting a blank new sheet. I'll give you 1 second to try and remember how we do that. If we want to add a new sheet, how do we do that in a workbook? Okay, we'll go down to the plus button down here and add one new sheet. So we got a blank sheet to start with. And let's go to sheet 1 here and right click and choose the option to delete sheet 1. It's going to ask us, are you sure you want to do that? Because there's no going back. And let's do that and click delete. And in cell A1, let's type in the types of data that Excel accepts. Okay. And let's go, we just hit enter to get down to this cell A2 here. And let's go ahead and just put one more space in here and type in the 4 different categories of data that Excel accepts. Let's start the list by typing the word category in here in cell A3, hitting enter. And let's go up to cell B3 and type in example. Just to let you know too, if you hit enter you're in the edit mode now, and the edit mode is started by just typing in anything into the cell. So when I typed in the very first E, I was already by default in the edit mode here. You can see the cursor blinking to indicate that I'm in edit mode, and I'll type in the rest of it, example. If I hit tab, it's going to take me one cell to the right, so cell C3. If I hit enter, it's going to take me one cell down, so the active cell becomes B4. So if you want to try that, hit the tab key. You'll see that the active region goes to C3 rather than B4. Right? That's just one of the quick tips you'll learn in speeding your way around Excel as you begin working in it longer. So let's move down now to cell A4 by just hitting the arrow keys and putting in the category of logical. The example of logical, it's kind of a tricky one here to get us started. We're going to start off by typing in equals into the formula bar and typing in, how about 3 is less than 2. So 3 less than 2. And we already know before we hit enter that something strange is going to happen here. What Excel is doing is evaluating whether or not that statement is true. So just ask yourself first here, is 3 less than 2? Obviously the answer is no. And so what it's going to return when you hit enter is false. And that is the first data type that Excel will hold in the values. So let's take a look at some of the others, and then maybe it will settle in a little bit more. Let's type in, how about category for text? Okay, and in cell B5, this is already what we've been doing, so this is very familiar. Let's type in, this is some example text. And we'll hit the tab key and see what happens when in cell C5 we type the word string. So some people get really uncomfortable with this idea that this cell B5, the wording is cut off. And that's just because that's how Excel will show the values if the column is only so big. So if we wanted to, we could go move our cursor up to to the column B and go to the right just between B and C and see our cursor change somewhere when we get to the gray line, when the mouse is hovering over the gray line. Now if you click and hold and drag, it will make it a little bit bigger and you can see more of the text appear. If you double click in between the B and C when the cursor has changed from the down arrow to this arrow right here, then it will automatically snap to as wide as it needs to be. So all I did was double click right there. I'll try that one more time. I'll just resize it down to make it smaller, and then I'll double click. And what Excel is doing is making this column as wide as it needs to be for the widest bit of information in any cell in this column. I know that sounded a little confusing, but if this cell right here had a lot of text in it, it would just make it as big as any of the widest text in that column. So when you play with that more, you'll see what I mean, and we'll keep moving to kind of look at the other examples here. So we typed in text to say this is an example of when you type text into Microsoft Excel, it's going to hold the text right here in the value. What they call that is a string. Okay, so having the text here in the cell, it's all held together. This is some example text with spaces in between, and Excel is holding that value inside of cell B5, but it's text. Okay, it's not a number, right, which we're going to see in a second is one of the types of data that Excel accepts. It's not a true-false evaluative statement, but just text, characters put together, and we call that a string. So let's go ahead and delete cell C5. I just wanted you to see that that is the name of this type of data right here. Okay, and let's also do a category for error. And cell B6, we'll do an example of this time equals, how about 10 divided by 0? Now again, you know this is going to be kind of a strange situation here because we can't divide numbers by 0. So if we do equals 10 divided by 0 and hit enter, we're going to get an error message. It says div divided by 0. And don't worry, we'll go over formulas in much more detail. So where we're typing in equals, that's where things get a little tricky. So the equal sign is just doing in this operation. It's taking 10 divided by 0. And it's telling us, hey, you can't do that. There's an error message. We can't divide numbers by 0. It doesn't know how to handle that. No calculator knows how to handle that. And if you do, you should apply for some mathematical position somewhere because no one has been able to handle dividing by 0. This is one of our mathematical laws. So we've gone through 3 of the categories here. A logical says we're evaluating some statement to say if it's true or false, and we're storing that bit of information. We have text that we use in Microsoft Excel. An example is this is some example text. We have an error message like div over 0. And the last one is number. Let's type in the number 10 to represent that number. Let's dive in just a little bit more into the Excel data type of a number. This is very simple here that the number 10 is listed here, and you see it again in the formula bar, but there are some unusual circumstances that happen with numbers, such as when we have a fraction like equals 1 divided by 3. You can try this with me if you'd like. If you hit enter, you know that the result of this 1 divided by 3 is 0.3 repeating. Now Excel has to figure out what should it do with this number that doesn't end. It's showing you maybe 8 or 9 instances of the number 3 here, but you know that mathematically speaking this 3 goes on forever. So you have some options. You can right click in this cell B8 and go to Format Cells. And this will give you the option to choose the visual layout of the number, even though you know in the computer it's storing as many 3s as it possibly can. And there are some instances where, you know, perhaps you'd like to show the number maybe with only 2 decimals, maybe you want it rounded to just 1 decimal, and sometimes where you might need to use for large numbers a comma separator. For this example, let's just change the decimal places to 1. So all I did was click on number and change the decimal places to 1 and hit OK. You'll see that the change has been made here, but this is a very important idea here that although this says 0.3, it has not actually rounded the number. So if you were to go on further and use this number in some other subsequent calculation, it would use 0.333 repeating instead of just 0.3. And this might seem like a small difference, but if you work in, let's say, the financial industry, you can't have rounding errors whenever you do calculations. So keep this in mind. If you are in a spreadsheet where you know that the decimal point matters and you need to make sure that the calculation is being done on the actual number 0.3 repeating rather than 0.3, then just be careful of this situation. So as it stands here, you see that example. You should also be aware of numbers as they relate to dates. So a date is kind of a special case of a number. So we'll kind of write this below, and let's type in, let's just put January 1st, 2030, and hit enter. Now, when you hit enter, it will automatically format it to however it would like for the default settings, and it's going to show, January 1st, 2030 in the cell here. You can change that again by right-clicking and going to Format Cells, and you have all different kinds of options in terms of date. You can see there that Excel already recognized that this is a date, and it gave you some options as to how to display it. So this is the default option, but you could scroll down and change it to anything that you like. Maybe you only want the number and then the three characters to symbolize the month. So we could make it look just like that. So look what happened here. In the formula bar, it's still showing the exact date, 1/1/2030, and here it just says the first day of January. So this is useful in situations where whoever's looking at your spreadsheet only needs to know the day and the month, and the year is irrelevant for whatever they're visually looking at on the spreadsheet. Again, just like the decimal 0.3, we should be careful with dates. There are situations where you might do even a calculation with a date, and you should know exactly which date is being used in the background to perform that calculation. So what Excel is doing is actually storing the date as a number. So this is kind of confusing. It's a very detailed topic to get into. People have debated how to handle calendars for a long time. I remember in Y2K, there was this whole issue that the whole computer systems were going to crash everywhere because they didn't know how to handle dates and the rollover to the 2000s. Well, we've made it past that, thankfully, and there are no issues with holding dates into the future. But you should be aware, again, just like 0.3, the specific date is being calculated. In Excel, you can actually do formulas, and again, we'll talk about formulas later, but you could do something like take the date and then add 30 days to it. So this is what's happening here when I write that formula, and it's giving me the 31st of January. But what's important to know, again, is that this value is relative to the year 2030. So be careful with numbers. Make sure you understand what's happening here. We'll look at specific cases where we could actually round this number to 0.3. So we would do a special formula here. Instead of it being equals 1 divided by 3, we might add in a little special syntax here that says round the value to 0.3. So then that we can use this in future calculations, and maybe that's what we're actually looking for rather than using the number 0.3 repeating. So this is a summary of the different types of data that Excel accepts. We talked about the different categories of a logical, true or false, and this is unlike all of the other types. We will use this later on in the course. Text, and you see some example here. The most common probably used in Microsoft Excel, besides that of a number. Error messages are handled a little bit differently than the others, and some different examples of numbers. This should give you the confidence to know what's happening to Excel when you might get certain error messages. So let me just recap by saying the whole reason why I went through all of these different data types is you might get error messages as you're working through Microsoft Excel. You might be able to diagnose a problem faster if you see that, or if you're thinking of the fact that Excel might be interpreting this 0.3 as 0.3 repeating, and now that I know that, I can fix the problem. So this is just something to hang on to as we move along in the course. You're now set for learning the more advanced topics in Microsoft Excel.